Hi everyone, welcome back. This is part two. Well, not really part two. I guess the second gap that I want to cover. Um, talking about the Cold War, right? We've talked about sort of the early showdowns, Korea, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Talked about the Vietnam War. That's in the '60s and into the '70s. But so in the '70s and '80s, there are some things that I just want to very briefly cover. And in the 1970s, the Cold War enters this period that people at the time and historians call détente. So I know it looks like detente. It's a French word, détente. Um, and it means a lessening of tension. So kind of both the Soviets and the U.S. realized, look, it's not actually in our best interest to blow each other up off the planet. So let's see if we can live together. So there's the Soviet Premier Brezhnev and the U.S. President Nixon talking together. How can we live together? We don't have to agree with each other, but how can we just avoid destroying the Earth? So partly this happens with a lot of different treaties, primarily looking at nuclear weapons. So bans on testing nuclear weapons, certain treaties about how many nuclear weapons you can have. Let's not build more. But this also happens with other things, like the United States ships grain to the Soviet Union when they're running short. There on the right, there is happy Russian lady with her American corn. The most famous example of this is the Apollo-Soyuz missions. So in the 1970s, the U.S. and Soviet space programs that were competing for a time worked together as a joint program, most famously actually meeting in space. You can't really see this picture, but so that's going on in the 1970s. In 1979, though, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. So Afghanistan back then was ruled by a communist state. But it was getting unstable, so the Soviet Union invaded to help the communists stay in power. Um, and they were fighting against these guerrillas. So it's actually very similar to Vietnam in that it's like big superpower, and then a bunch of small guerrillas, guerrilla fighters who actually. So these guys are they're Muslims, right, in Afghanistan. So they see the conflict as being against the atheist Soviet Union fighting against the righteous Muslim fighters here. They call themselves mujahideen, which is like a word for an Islamic fighter. So the Soviet Union just keeps fighting, can't seem to win in Afghanistan, can't seem to get out, and the United States is supplying these mujahideen. And then in 1980, something happens. And that's Ronald Reagan gets elected. And Reagan does not want to get on with the Soviet Union. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. He wants to have a showdown with them. That's part of his whole election plan. He says that. And so he steps up tensions with the Soviet Union. And people often call the 1980s the second Cold War. So he invests a lot of money in expanding the military. Kind of the most famous of this is a strategic defense initiative. So it's invest billions of dollars in this plan that's basically we're going to use lasers in space to shoot down Soviet missiles, um, which sounds really cool, right? But it's actually a terrible idea. So it's a great idea, but I mean it's diplomatically it's super scary to the Soviets because now if the U.S. doesn't have to worry about Soviet missiles hitting them, what's to stop the United States from launching all their missiles and not worrying about the Soviets? So the Soviet Union tries to expand their military to match. So there's this new arms race in the 1980s. Um, you end up with this economic showdown. But there's, the Soviet Union and the capitalist United States, and they're both investing lots and lots of money in this arms race. But as it happens, the U.S. economy by the 1980s, it's much more efficient. So, here's a 1980s Soviet car on the left versus a 1980s Western car on the right. By the 1980s, Western consumer goods are capitalist consumer goods are much, much higher quality than the Soviet goods. Partly because if a Western business makes bad stuff, it'll go out of business and disappear. If a Soviet business makes bad stuff, well, it's all owned by the government, so they'll just keep making bad stuff. Um, there's very little incentive in communism, and it's inefficient. So this contributes to the economic showdown. In a couple of weeks, I'll tell you how it ends. That's that. See you guys next time.